and we're continuing our discussion of the kingdom of God as revealed in Jesus' parables. And I'm kind of batting 1,000 recently at picking tough parables to talk about. Some of Jesus' hardest teachings. Maybe that's just what happens when you get into the gospel. You start to realize that Jesus said a lot of challenging things. And the parable we're going to be looking at today is from Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 19. It's often called the parable of the tenants. And if this is a challenging parable for us, it's far more challenging for Jesus' original hearers when they first heard it. You can find this on page 744 of your pew Bibles, or you can follow along on the screen. So let's listen to God's word together. He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants, so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully, and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "May this never be." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people. Please pray. Lord God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the words of your son Jesus, for the stories he told, and for the images that he brought to life in his teaching, images of your kingdom, images of the ways that you're at work in this world. Sometimes, Lord, these images delight us. Sometimes these images delighted those who heard them, but other times they challenge us, and they're hard teachings. God, we pray that today as we reflect on these words of your son, that you would use these words to root down into our hearts, to transform us, to challenge us to be who you've called us to be. We pray, Lord, that you would be glorified in everything we say and everything we hear. It's in the name of your son, Jesus Christ, that we pray these things. Amen. Throughout much of the play, Hamlet, Shakespeare's character, the tormented young prince, seeks to expose the guilt of his uncle Claudius and his mother Gertrude, whom he believes conspired to murder his father, the former king of Denmark. And in the second act of the play, Hamlet outlines this ingenious plan to get a confession from the usurpers. He gathers a troupe of actors at the palace, and he commissions them to perform for the royal court a scene from a play, a scene from a melodramatic tragedy called The Murder of Gonzago. And Hamlet plots to watch his uncle closely as the play is being performed, and especially as the violent homicide at the heart of the play is enacted on the stage. And Hamlet wants to take note of any sign of shame or remorse or discomfort or simply guilty fear that he sees in his uncle's eyes as this homicide is taking place before him. He anticipates that the artful rendering of his uncle's crimes might prompt a confession, either verbal or silent, of his actions. And so Hamlet turns to the audience in an aside, and as he so often does, he speaks these words. He says, "I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have by the very cunning of the scene been struck to the soul so presently that they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organs. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before my uncle. I'll observe his looks. I'll tint him to the quick. If he but blanch, I know my course. The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." See, Hamlet understood, because his creator Shakespeare understood, the power of a story to convict those who hear it, to move an audience toward an encounter with their own weaknesses and their shortcomings. To see in the misdeeds of the characters some reflection of their own sin. But genius that he was, Shakespeare didn't come up with this idea. Telling stories is an ancient method for uncovering the truth. The prophets of the Old Testament, from Nathan to Ezekiel, often use these imaginative narratives to speak judgment against kings and kingdoms who had rebelled against the ways of God, who had strayed, and who had led their people into sin. And Jesus, a prophetic teacher who was certainly no slouch at speaking truth to power, was also adept at choosing the right story for the right occasion to prompt the right response from those he wanted to confront. This is one of the amazing things about Jesus' parables. See, Jesus' stories were both effective for their ability to reveal and to conceal the truth of God's kingdom. The language and the images that Jesus used were often simple enough for a child to understand. But when Jesus wanted to take a subtle dig, or when he wanted to make kind of a backdoor accusation against one of his elitist opponents, Jesus' parables were just the thing to do the trick. Just the thing to catch the conscience of those who were rebelling against the ways of God. The parable that we looked at a few moments ago, just like Hamlet's play, is one of the clearest and best examples from the Gospels of this kind of indirect attack by Jesus on some of his more hostile opponents, some of his more dangerous enemies. This is a story that was meant to strike its hearers to their very souls. It was meant to pronounce judgment upon those who thought that they were above judgment. It was a story that was meant to provoke guilt in those who claimed to be righteous. This story from Luke chapter 20 is often called the parable of the tenants or the parable of the vineyard. And it's rooted in some sense in an Old Testament illustration from the 5th chapter of the book of Isaiah. See, just like Shakespeare, Jesus was not above. In fact, he was quite skilled at taking stories from his past and images from his tradition and building on them and then making them his own so that they would serve his purpose. And everyone in Jesus' audience would have been familiar with Isaiah's version of the story. This was a story that Isaiah called the Song of the Vineyard. And it spoke of God's faithful love, but it also spoke of Israel's stubborn disobedience. In the story that Isaiah tells, God is presented as a planter of a vineyard. He says, "My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well." I've never been to the wine country of Napa Valley. I've never visited the lush vineyards of Tuscany, but from pictures, I can tell that these are some of the most stunningly gorgeous places on earth. Those who have worked to plant and to tend these agricultural treasures invest their lives in the task of making something special. And I'm convinced that the vineyard that Isaiah describes in chapter 5 of his book could hold its own with any Tuscan property. So in these beautiful and poetic verses, Isaiah describes the care and the love that the landowner put into his vineyard, the long hours that he spent to ensure that it would be abundantly fruitful. But then Isaiah's story takes a turn. Isaiah says of the landowner, he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. And the landowner expresses frustration and puzzlement at this failure to produce. He asks, "What more could I have done?" And then he decides that he's going to take away the hedge from around the vineyard. He's going to break down its wall. Once more, the vineyard will become a barren wasteland. And finally, the prophet Isaiah delivers the kicker, kind of the punchline to his song. He says that the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight. But he looked for justice and saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress. Now, this was undoubtedly a lament that Israel knew well, that Jesus' people had internalized. It was a song that they had sung during their long years of exile and occupation. See, they knew that they had been chosen, just like that plot of land, just like that vineyard in the story. They had been chosen to bear fruit for God. They knew that God had poured his love and his kindness into their life as a people. But they also knew that they had exchanged faithfulness for idolatry. They knew that generations of false worship and injustice had diminished the life, it had diminished the abundance among them with every passing year. Every time that Jesus' contemporaries saw a Roman soldier in the holy city, I have to imagine they felt a kind of twinge of melancholy. The awareness that they were living out in their exile the barrenness that Isaiah had described. And they were longing for the day when they might once again produce fruit for their Creator. So when Jesus, who was by now believed to be the Messiah in the eyes of many in his audience, takes up this ancient song, when Jesus takes up this prophetic proclamation of judgment and exile against Israel, you can bet that their ears would have perked up. You can bet that they were anxious to hear what Jesus had to say. And you can probably bet that they expected that Jesus' parable of the vineyard would have a different ending than Isaiah's version. But as we'll see, when Jesus tells his story, the people who are listening to him don't necessarily like what they hear. See, like Isaiah, Jesus tells of a man who planted a vineyard, but then he entrusted it to the care of others, a group of tenants. And he expected that these tenants would be good stewards of the land. But when the time came for the tenant farmers to give the landowners some of the fruit, some yield of the produce, they refused. As the landowners sent servant after servant to collect, they treated each one more shamefully than the last. They beat the landowners' messengers. They ridiculed them. They threw them out of the vineyard because they thought that they could hold on to the land, that they could hold on to the produce that the landowner had given them to cultivate and care for. In other words, these wicked tenants, these bad stewards, wanted to grasp and keep for themselves what didn't belong to them, but rather what belonged to their master. And so finally, the owner of the vineyard reaches what probably seems like an extreme conclusion. I will send my son, he says. Surely the tenants will respect my son. Surely they will listen to him. Surely they will obey the claim that he places on them. But of course, as we know from the story, they treat the son worst of all. Because they convince themselves through some distorted, twisted logic that if they can eliminate the son from the picture, then not only will they not have to yield their obligation to the landowner, but they'll actually be able to take charge of the vineyard for themselves. So in the story, they take hold of the son and they kill him. They throw him out of the vineyard. And just like Isaiah's earlier song of the vineyard, the conclusion to this story is bleak. Jesus says the landowner will come, he will punish those tenants, and he will give the vineyard to others, to caretakers who will be faithful stewards instead of predatory usurpers. Now, the early church wasted very little time in developing what we might call an allegorical interpretation of this story. For those first century Jews who saw Jesus' work as a fulfillment of God's covenant plan, it wasn't difficult to see how this story that Jesus told mirrored the history of the covenant. And that it also mirrored the tragedy of Jesus' rejection by many of his own people. So in this interpretation, just like Isaiah's, the vineyard constitutes the promises of God. The vineyard symbolizes the representation and the revelation of God's kingdom. Now for some, this would have been symbolized by the nation of Israel. For others, it might have been by the city of Jerusalem, and maybe most specifically the temple. God had entrusted the care of the vineyard to a group of tenants. These were the people God had called to shepherd his people, to proclaim truth, to embody justice, to help Israel realize a vision of a kingdom community, and to foster a witness to all nations. Specifically, these tenants that Jesus talks about represented the religious and political leaders of the people, the priests, the scribes, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the kings, and advisors, the Sadducees, and others. As both Isaiah and Jesus, along with numerous other prophets, would attest, these tenant stewards failed miserably at their task. See, instead of remembering their place, instead of remembering that they had been appointed to care for God's people, instead they selfishly elevated themselves. Instead of producing fruit for God, those charged with leading the people had withheld the benefits of the vineyard for themselves. They had treated their vocation, they had treated their calling as though it were a birthright. And they had excluded all those of whom they didn't approve because they weren't like them or because they didn't always do the right things or the things that they saw as the right things. Yet God patiently bore with the people. God even patiently bore with their leaders. Repeatedly, in both the parable and in the history it reflects, God sent servants to demand accountability. God sent prophets to warn these leaders. Repeatedly, God gave these wicked tenants, these negligent leaders, a chance to do the right thing. But repeatedly, they refused to listen. They mocked and they ridiculed and they martyred the prophets. And they became more deeply entrenched with each passing generation in their conviction that they knew what was best, that they were in control. Finally, God sent his Son as a sort of final attempt to win these tenants back to the kingdom, a sort of ultimate opportunity to elicit obedience and even love, where before there had been stubborn willfulness, where before there had been arrogant rejection. But the Son, of course, fared no better at the hands of these tenants, these false shepherds. In fact, because the Son came to them with more authority, because the Son came to them as a more direct representation of the landowner, of God, because he represented God most fully, their response to the Son was all the more violent. They could not tolerate the way that Jesus' very existence, his manner of life, his way of shepherding the people in truth and justice, called to account everything they did. Their response to the very Son of the one who had commissioned them to serve was not humble allegiance. Rather, it was hostile rejection. They killed the Son outside the holy city. And even as they were doing it, they deceived themselves into thinking that they were just doing their job, that they might even be rewarded for their dispatching of this nuisance. But instead, as Jesus' parable warns them, their position, their prestige, and their power, even the very things in which they placed their hope, Jerusalem, the temple, the institutions of religious and political life that had sustained their lofty vision of themselves, would be stripped away and given to others. So biblically and theologically speaking, this is a parable about God's patient forbearance with those he loves. But it's also a parable about God's judgment upon those who continually break faith with him. From a historical perspective, we can see how this parable's prophetic ending bore out. Those leaders who grasped at positions of pride, who grasped at positions of power, those leaders who clung tenaciously to their own vision of the way things should be, would feel the weight of cataclysmic events that would unfold in their midst. Within just a generation of Jesus' death and resurrection, Jerusalem would be attacked and besieged and basically destroyed by Roman armies. The temple would be reduced to a pile of rubble. The priesthood would become a nostalgic memory rather than a viable office. And perhaps most significantly, the care of God's people would be taken away from these wicked tenants. They would be taken away from these failed leaders and given to a new group. The care of God's people would be given to this collective of unlettered fishermen and small-time ex-zealots and women of ill repute and tax collectors and a host of others who never would have passed the entrance exam for rabbi school, but who, in the words of Paul, were called to be Christ's ambassadors, ministers of reconciliation. And this is where Jesus' parable and its early interpretations differs most from Isaiah's song. See, in Isaiah's version, the vineyard would become a barren wasteland, as though God's work in cultivating it had been a waste. But in Jesus' version, the care of the property is transferred. God's promises, God's purposes would not be destroyed. God's kingdom would be realized. God's holy and transformative love would not be denied. But those who thought they were in charge of the kingdom, those who thought they would preside over the harvest, would find that all-important task given to others, to the unassuming and unimpressive men and women who weren't fit to sit at table with him, but who would become a new sort of priesthood, the shepherds of a new kind of covenant community. N.T. Wright says that this parable functions as an urgent summons. He says it attempts to break open the worldview of the present tenants and replace it with a new one. He says that this parable tells those leaders that their implicit controlling story has reached its crisis. It threatens some of their cherished symbols and practices. It offers new and startling answers to their underlying worldview questions. And if what N.T. Wright says was true in the first century, I believe it's still true for us today. I believe that this parable was meant to break open the worldview of the Pharisees and chief priests in first century Jerusalem so that their hearts and their minds might become a fertile soil in which God would produce a harvest. And I believe that it's meant to do the same for us. And had those original leaders responded to Jesus' parable with humility, with remorse, maybe even with an awareness of their own shortcomings, then the kind of harvest that God desired might have been possible. But instead, we read at the end of the passage that they heard these words, and immediately they began looking for a way that they might arrest Jesus. In other words, these scribes and these priests heard Jesus' prophecy, and they immediately set about fulfilling it. And this parable is meant to break open our worldview as well. This parable is meant, I think, to call us to new and more faithful and deeper forms of discipleship and service. The gospel comes to us as it came to Jesus' earliest opponents with this potential to subvert some of our central stories, to challenge some of our treasured perspectives, to reorient some of our comfortable practices. The movement of God's kingdom is no less disturbing to our carefully ordered ways of life and no less threatening to our notions of power than it was 2,000 years ago. The question for us is whether, when we hear these words, we'll make the same kind of mistake that the Pharisees and the priests did. See, like Israel, like the 12, like Paul and Barnabas and all the early leaders of the church, we have been called to be a covenant community. We are a royal priesthood, Peter says. We are called to be God's instruments in bringing everything under the lordship of Christ. We have been given opportunity after opportunity to bear fruit. Sometimes we're faithful in responding to these opportunities. Sometimes God blesses our work with an abundant harvest of the fruit of his kingdom. But other times we falter. And one thing we must always keep in mind, and this was something that the religious elites of Jesus' day apparently forgot, is that the harvest does not belong to us. We are stewards. We are caring for a gift that we can never possess for our own purposes, the gift of God's kingdom. We are tenants. We are cultivating a kingdom that we can never rule. There's joy in the service, and there is peace that comes with knowing that we are serving faithfully. But these fruits of the Spirit can never give way to arrogance or pride about who we are. If they do, then just like the leaders in Jesus' day, we're going to inevitably lose our focus. We'll inevitably abandon our vocation. In Charles Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities, Dickens writes, "Crush humanity out of shape once more, and it will twist itself into the same tortured forms. Sow the same seeds of rapacious license and oppression over again, and it will surely yield the same fruit according to its kind." In other words, what he was saying is that we as human beings are inclined to repeat the mistakes of the past, especially when it comes to how we handle the power of responsibility. Dickens was writing about the context of tyranny that followed the French Revolution, but his statements could apply to the church as well. We can never just assume that we won't make the same mistakes that the religious leaders of Jesus' day, from Herod, the governor, to Pilate, to the Pharisees, to the chief priests, to the Sadducees, to the teachers of the law, and everyone that was in charge in those days, on down. See, like them, we also sometimes tune out the prophetic voices that might challenge us. Like the leaders of Jesus' day, we sometimes study the scriptures, but we don't allow them to speak a clear word of conviction to our lives. Like them, we sometimes run the risk of placing so many things that are not Jesus, that are not his kingdom, at the top of our list of priorities, and we ignore what is most important. Like them, we are guilty at times of trying to shrink the kingdom down to fit our agendas, of trying to remake the Son in our image. And like the religious people of first century Jerusalem, the church of today must confess its unfaithfulness at times. We must allow our hearts to be turned back to God and turned back to his purposes. We must shepherd those around us, whoever they might be, faithfully and humbly. See, as in Jesus' day, God's mission in this world is grander and it's stranger at times than we might imagine. The church's witness has diminished somewhat in places where it once held fast, places like Europe and North America. But the church has been bearing an abundant harvest in some familiar and unexpected places. We got to hear last week from Marshall Hayden about how the church is growing in southern Africa. The same could be said for South America and East Asia and all sorts of places that, as recently as 100 years ago, we viewed as pagan mission fields. Now, we could resent this. We could pretend it's not happening. We could pretend that we still have all the answers. Or we could celebrate and learn from it. We could reject the lessons that God might want to teach us through unlikely prophets. Or we could embrace them. We could look down at those who are not like us, but who have a truth to speak. Or we could listen attentively to what they have to say. We could say with a possessive and proud spirit, may it never be. May this never be. Or we could say in humble obedience, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. See, just like the people of Jesus' day, God wants us to be a part of what he is doing. But he won't force our hand. So I believe that when we read this parable, when we hear Jesus' words here, the call to us is to step together into the work of the kingdom of God, however and whenever and wherever God might choose to reveal it. Please pray. God, we thank you that you have not stopped surprising us, Lord, in all the many generations that have read your word, and all the many generations that have encountered your Son. You continue to surprise us with who he is and how he reveals who you are, how he reveals the nature of your kingdom. But God, we confess that sometimes we don't like surprises. Sometimes we like things to stay the way they are. Sometimes we like things to remain comfortable. Sometimes we like things to remain safe. God, like those tenants in Jesus' parable, we confess that in our heart of hearts, there are times when we want to grasp at what we have and not let it go. We don't want to free up what you're doing. We don't want to free up the fruit that you're producing so that it might change lives around us, so that it might impact this world in some powerful and beautiful ways. God, help us to live lives of abandon to you and abandon to your kingdom. Help us to be open to your gospel and its movement, to your kingdom and its power, however these things might work themselves out in our lives and in our church and in our community and in this world. God, help us not to look at things that might challenge us and say, may this never be. I don't like this. But instead to embrace it. To look at what you're doing, to have eyes and ears to see the ways that you're working, and to allow ourselves to be changed, to allow our hearts to be transformed, to be open to all the strange and wonderful ways that you are at work. And God, I pray that would begin with the hearts of those people gathered in this room. God, I pray that you would use your word to probe down into our lives, to penetrate into our hearts, and to sow the seeds of your kingdom there, that we might bear fruit for you. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and to your glory that we pray these things. Amen.